This is a Sunday Rich Lieberman Media Pulse, a story that I've told to few people, and it's kind of interesting and sort of odd in a kind of a weird way. And but it is 100% true, and I wanted to relay it to you guys because I think it's kind of it's good. It's good schmoozing Sunday cloudy rainy day kind of stories and all that. So in the 70s, when KGO is just beginning to get its cachet as a big time radio station, it was run by Mickey Luckoff, who's still alive. And in fact, he was a speaker at some event a couple of weeks ago in Jack London Square. I think it was something women in broadcasting, and he spoke, and people like Marsha Brandwin was there, and Roberta Gonzalez, and a few other people. And I bring this up because it reminded me of this story that I'm about to tell you that a lot of people don't know about, but is very true and unusual, kind of odd in a way, and has to do with Tom Snyder. Now, you guys remember Tom Snyder, right? You have to. Tom Snyder was the late night host of the Tomorrow Show. Now, if you remember the Tomorrow Show, I mean, he did other things too, but Tom Snyder was, and they did this show in a really small studio with a desk, no audience, a light, and he's interviewing somebody, and that's it. And it was like a half hour, and it was sometimes an hour, but it was really, really good television. And he had some big time guests, and it wasn't just celebrities; it was newsmakers. It could be people in music, acting, politicians, people in the news. I'll never forget when he had on Snyder, Charles Manson. Remember that? When he says to Chuck Manson, as he referred to him one time, you're a little tense. Do you want to hit me? You want to hit? I'm doing my Tom Snyder impression. But he would talk like this, right? And he would smoke the cigarette. I'm talking about Tom Snyder now, and smoke cigarettes and drink coffee, and he sounded like, in a way, almost like Nixon. But he was great interviewer, as most of you who watch that show will know and remember. Great interview. He had a sense of humor. He became so big and so popular that, and this is when you know you made it, the people on Saturday Night Live did a rendition or an impression of Tom Snyder. One of their actors, one of the, I think, not ready for prime time. I think it could have been Dan Aykroyd, but I don't know. That's not the point of this story anyway. But so Tom Snyder was big, and he was late night, but he followed Carson, right? So he had a pretty good audience. And like I said, you all know this if you watched it, he did a damn good interview. All right, let's cut to my story. So you have a little bit of background of Tom Snyder. Mickey Luckoff was the KGO radio ABC exec. He was responsible for KGO and ABC radio at the time. So Snyder did the show out of New York, but he had a house in LA. Occasionally they did the show there at NBC in Burbank, right? And little did many people know that Snyder was a big talk show fan. Used to love listening to radio talk shows, right? KABC, KGO. Now, why do I bring up KGO? Because Snyder had a house in Marin County. I believe it was Belvedere, but it was somewhere in that kind of well-to-do area, Belvedere or Tiburon. And I don't know how it came to be, But he met up with Mickey Luckoff. And Snyder always wanted to do a radio show, right? Maybe once a week, talk to politicians, talk to celebrities, and do a radio show, which is not that unusual. Very common practice today. Larry King, in his golden era, before he did the CNN show, he was on Mutual Radio, right? So there's a common theme there. So Snyder meets up with Mickey Luckoff. And mind you, again, he's got a Northern California connection, lives in Tiburon, Belvedere, wherever, and listened to KGO. You never knew that because nobody ever told you the story. They never talked about it. And he did meet up with Luckoff. And boy, oh boy, you talk about fire and ice. It never worked out. Now, Luckoff, who was a programming genius, very, very respected, legit, knew his craft, although there was a side of Luckoff that many people detested, namely a guy by the name of Ron Owens, who beat Luckoff in an arbitration case. This was right around the time when Ron was doing his show, right when he came back from LA. Remember, he was doing the LA show, or he was broadcasting to the Bay Area, and he was in LA. And then one week he'd come from LA, go back to San Francisco. That was a disaster. He never warmed, I'm talking about Ron, he never warmed to the LA audience. The LA audience never cared for him. But that's not, again, the point of this story. Luckoff was the genius behind KGO Radio. But he was more feared than he was respected amongst some of the people who worked at KGO, because he was very tough, didn't have much of it. I say was, he's still alive, very, very much alive in his, I believe, mid 80s. And anyway, the story goes that Tom Snyder, as I just indicated, very much wanted to do a radio show. And he lived a lot up in Marin County. And he figured that he has the name. He can obviously interview, which he did a hell of a job of. And that would translate to Radio Gold, which it would have. Now, for some reason, I don't know what the deal was, but he didn't try to pitch this job in Los Angeles, probably because they didn't do the show much in LA. It was primarily New York. But I do know that he spent a lot of his time in the Bay Area, in Marin. And he was an avid listener in those days, who wasn't, of KGO Radio. And these were the days where you had Ron Owens, Jim Eason, Owen Spann, Art Finley. The news guy was Jim Dunbar and Ted Wygant. So, again, let's cut back to the original point of this story. So he meets up, Luckoff, with Tom Snyder. And as I said, fire and ice, didn't hit it off, both of them. And just really antagonistic. You'd figure, pure common sense, logic, that there'd be an interest amongst both. And I guess the fact that Luckoff felt, so the story goes, what I heard, that Snyder had an ego, that he was assuming that it would just be, oh yeah, no problem, come in, do a weekend show or something like that on KGO, because his time was limited, right? He worked a week doing the Tomorrow Show, and see, it didn't go off well. And I heard it was so antagonistic that they were, frankly, more than just agitated. It got heated. And I think, without being there, two huge egos. Now, Snyder, of course, he had an ego. Who wouldn't have an ego? You have to have an ego to do a job like that. For that matter, if you're working in media, by definition, we all have egos, right? But to really have a super ego, which makes for most of the time good communication, good interactive, good all of the above. And Luckoff had an ego, huge ego, which probably was part of the reason why he was successful. Anyway, they didn't mesh. And it was not only heated, it was agitated and almost anger. And I wasn't there. Obviously, I'm hearing this story from years and years ago, but hasn't really been told. But when you figure two very dynamic people, one on the programming side, the other on the performing side, combine that with the fact that you have Tom Snyder, who was supposed to be somewhat of a putz, right? A schmuck, but he was so damn good on television. And he had a knack too. And I think he had an early career in New York radio. I'm not certain of that. I could look it up. But in any event, it would have been a fantastic idea. It never came to fruition because, and this is the thing that always gets me when I hear about this story. And I'm sure this is not the only story amongst two other people or other high profile artists, is they let ego get in the way of common sense. And they don't look at the big picture, so to speak. Now, I am almost positive that had Snyder gotten his wish and they could have worked out a deal with Mickey Luckoff, he would have been a dynamic talk figure on KGO. Would have been appointment radio because he had that knack, he had that personality. And yes, he could interview. And first of all, he had the name. And in the height of the popularity of the Tomorrow Show, he was big time. And again, helped the fact that he was following Carson. We all know about Johnny Carson, 20 million people. And this was, mind you, before the internet. And Carson would beat every challenge. Remember? He even beat those other shows and beat Nightline and all that. They threw everything at him. He had a great lead in, did Tom Snyder, but he also was singularly in his way very distinct, very, very successful. And, you know, he spawned a lot of folks who tried the same premise. Charlie Rose. I know he was a big fan of Dick Cavett. And what defined that, as I described to you, was no audience. I think Cavett later on had an audience, but Charlie Rose never had an audience. Remember, he had the oval desk. He had the two spotlights or whatever, the stage lights, and interviewee. I remember, and I'll get back to Snyder in a second, but Charlie Rose, we all know his career ended with all these allegations about him and, you know, women and all that, the Me Too thing. But he interviewed Richard Gere, and Richard Gere didn't do a lot of interviews. In fact, I think the only time Richard Gere would to do interviews was when he was promoting movies, right? He didn't do a lot of, well, most people only do interviews when they're promoting, but you know what I mean. He didn't really make the Tonight Show circuit and all that, unless he was plugging various movies. Back to Snyder. Snyder, I know because I saw Charlie Rose interview, and there were others too. I mentioned Cavett, but they wanted to be stylistically like Tom Snyder did Charlie Rose with the desk, the interviewee, and you'd watch it because it was interesting. And if you liked that kind of style, and you know, frankly, and it's so evident today, these audiences are so ridiculous, and the screaming, and you know, they didn't applaud or anything like that. They shrieked. Well, not they shrieked. They shriek today. Kimmel. I don't watch these network shows anymore, but Kimmel's halfway decent. But even Colbert, but it's too predictable. Anyway, my point is the interview technique, the style that Snyder emulated was guest, no audience, theme, and it was 30 minutes. Sometimes I believe later on it would go to an hour if he'd have two guests, but usually it was one guest. And I mentioned, go look up the Manson interview. Boy, was that scary. But in any event, the idea that he met up with Luckoff, and I don't want to say they almost came to blows, but I heard it was very controversial because they just didn't hit it off. And if one or the other had looked the other way and said, you know what, we're not getting along, but would this be good for my product? Damn straight it would have been. Luckoff, I'm told, just didn't want anything to do with him. And I think, look, would it have defined Snyder's career? No, because it was unusual too. Remember now, I mentioned Larry King. Larry started out in radio. Then he became a fixture at CNN. So he went radio, then he went to television. This would have been an interesting turnaround. This is a really successful TV guy who had a desire to do a radio show. In any event, it never worked out. And that's one of the things about Luckoff to this day. Not just that story, but the fact that his demeanor, his whole whatever style was more fear and intimidation. And I'll say this, and I've said this to people, and I'm going to say it out loud. I respect, not that he gives a damn, but I'm just saying my 2 cents. I respect Mickey Luckoff because he presided over a time when KGO was so dominant, so big time. And he knew how to run a radio station. Of course, he worked with Jack Swanson, another former KGO exec, who also had a stint at KCBS. But they knew the business, duh. And I'll give Luckoff credit because it was his work, his style. And there was a time too where he didn't get along and vice versa with Ron Owens. But he understood business. He knew that Ron was good and talented and had the ratings, had all of this, magic formula. Enough of that in time to want to go syndicated. That never worked out. LA was not hip to Ron. But I'll give Luckoff credit for at least presiding over and being in the mix when KGO was big. But I will not give him credit for the fact that he could be overly intimidating and frankly downright mean. That's a personal knock, because I don't think you have to be mean to people in order to be successful. You can say your way and show everyone that you're in charge and all that, fine. I think the situation with Tom Snyder could have been a big time winner for both people, but it never ever materialized. And I told this story one time, and somebody said, geez, I didn't even know he lived up in the Bay Area. He did. He had Marin County roots, which dictated the fact that he used to listen to KGO quite a bit. And mind you, this was when KGO was in its heyday. And even the weekends were fantastic. People like John Wasserman, remember the critic, the late critic, the movie critic for the Chronicle, Jerry Nachman, the late singles writer and book author, and He wrote a lot about entertainment. Anyway, they did shows on KGO Saturday and Sunday, and you had people like Sonny Buxton, who's still alive, does a show on the jazz station, KCSM. That's how big and popular KGO was. And we won't talk about that anymore in that regard because that ship has sailed. But the Luckoff, Tom Snyder, a duo that you probably had no idea had a moment or two together. It didn't work out, but it probably would have been a masterful touch of good, solid radio interviewing. And oh well, thought you'd like that story, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hey, look, if you like my shows here on YouTube, please. I am an independent broadcaster. My survival is based upon your participation. I try to give you some scoops, some news, a little opinion, every now and then, hopefully, entertainment and stories like this one. If you like and are able to afford to throw me $5 or $10 or 20 or whatever you can afford, if you're Elon Musk, maybe 50 grand, I promise you that I will consider. No, I wouldn't even look at those cars. But anyway, okay, not funny. All right, especially in lieu of what's going on today. Please go to my PayPal icon here, click on it, and I will personally thank you via email or a call. Remember those old-fashioned days when we would phone people? If you don't want to be bothered, you want to remain anonymous, I will certainly honor that. But that's how I survive. You subsidize my work and so forth. So thanks for coming by here on a Sunday. It is a new month in a couple of days, and we will see you soon. Thanks for watching.